Picture this. It's 859 AD. The sun is just breaking over the hills of Fez, Morocco. A woman stands on an empty plot of land, her hands holding a roll of parchment covered in architectural plans. Her name is Fatima al-Fihri. She's wealthy, educated, and she's about to do something that will echo through 11 centuries. Around her, workers are gathering: stonemasons, carpenters, architects. She's not building a home. She's not building a palace. She's building the world's first university. And while she's laying the foundation for an institution that will still be teaching students 165 years later, Europe is stumbling through what historians politely call the Dark Ages. Most Europeans can't read. Most can't write. Kings are signing documents with an X because they never learned their own names. But here in Africa, a black woman is constructing a center of learning that will revolutionize human knowledge. That institution still stands today. It's called the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. The Guinness Book of World Records officially recognizes it as the oldest continuously operating educational institution in the world. Not Oxford, not Cambridge. An African university built by an African woman. And I'm willing to bet nobody ever taught you that. Nobody ever told you that while Europe was burning witches and dying of plague, Africa had universities with thousands of students studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. Nobody ever mentioned that the Pope himself studied at an African university and brought that knowledge back to Europe, where he got credit for introducing Arabic numerals. They never told you because if you knew the truth about African intellectual achievement, the entire narrative of white supremacy collapses like a house of cards. So let me be clear about what you're about to learn in this video. By the time we're done, you'll know the names and locations of multiple African universities that existed before Europe discovered books. You'll know the specific scholars who studied in Africa, took that knowledge to Europe, and got credit for discoveries that Africans made first. You'll understand the mathematical, medical, and astronomical breakthroughs that came from African institutions, but got erased from textbooks. And you'll see exactly why this erasure wasn't accidental. It was essential. It was policy. It was the foundation that made slavery and colonization morally acceptable to people who claim to follow a gospel of love. This isn't ancient trivia that has nothing to do with your life. This is your ancestral legacy, your bloodline, your stolen inheritance. When they enslaved your ancestors, the first thing they did was make it illegal to teach them to read. When they freed your ancestors, they burned black schools during Reconstruction. When your great-grandparents built Black Wall Street with universities and libraries, they burned that too. And when your children sit in underfunded schools, today being told they're not college material, it's the same system continuing the same erasure. After this video, you'll understand why they systematically destroy black educational institutions. You'll understand why they underfund black schools. You'll understand why the wealth gap exists. Because if black people knew their true intellectual heritage, if black children understood that their ancestors built universities while Europe lived in huts, the psychological chains of white supremacy would shatter immediately. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through 5 African universities that prove beyond any doubt that Africa led the world in education. We're going to name names, dates, locations, and numbers. We're going to look at the manuscripts, the buildings, the evidence that survived, despite everything they did to destroy it. Then we're going to trace exactly how this history got erased, the specific laws they passed, the textbooks they rewrote, the media manipulation they used. We're going to connect this erasure to every injustice you see today. And by the end, you're going to understand that your poverty isn't your fault. Your struggle isn't because of anything lacking in you. It's because they spent 400 years stealing your intellectual inheritance and then convinced you it never existed in the first place. You ready? because what I'm about to show you will change how you see yourself, your ancestors, and the entire story of human civilization. Let's start in Morocco in the year 859. Fatima al-Fihri was born in Tunisia around 800 AD. Her father was a wealthy merchant who made his fortune in trade. When he died, he left substantial inheritance to Fatima and her sister Maryam. Now here's what you need to understand about the world in 859 AD. The Islamic Golden Age is in full swing across North Africa and the Middle East. This is the era when Muslim scholars are translating Greek philosophy, advancing mathematics, pioneering surgical techniques, and mapping the stars. Centers of learning are popping up across the Islamic world. But there's no formal university yet. No institution that grants degrees, maintains a permanent faculty, and offers continuous education across generations. Fatima sees the need. She sees scholars traveling from city to city with nowhere to gather permanently. She sees students hungry for knowledge but no structured way to gain it. So she takes her entire inheritance and she pours it into creating something that's never existed before. She purchases land in the heart of Fez. She hires the finest architects and builders, and she begins construction on a mosque that will also function as a madrasa, an educational institution. But this isn't just any school. Fatima designs it with lecture halls, a library, student housing, and a structured curriculum. She establishes a system where students can study for years, complete courses, and receive certification. She creates the blueprint for what we now call a university. The construction takes years. Fatima oversees every detail. By the time it opens, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin has everything a modern university has. A library that will eventually hold over 4,000 manuscripts, some dating back to the 9th century. A faculty of scholars teaching theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, grammar, and rhetoric. A student body that will grow to hundreds and eventually thousands. A degree system that certifies graduates. This is not an informal school. This is a fully functioning university with institutional structure, academic rigor, and intellectual prestige. And it's being built by a Black African woman in 859 AD. Let that sink in for a moment. Harvard was founded in 1636. That's 777 years after Al-Qarawiyyin. Oxford started teaching around 1096. That's 237 years after Al-Qarawiyyin. The University of Bologna, often called Europe's oldest university, began around 1088. That's 229 years after Al-Qarawiyyin. When Fatima al-Fihri opened the doors of her university, Europe was in the middle of the Dark Ages. Charlemagne had died 28 years earlier. The Holy Roman Empire was fragmenting. Viking raids were terrorizing coastal towns. Literacy rates in Europe were below 5%. The idea of a university wouldn't reach Europe for another 2 centuries. But here's where it gets even more interesting. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin didn't just exist. It thrived. It became one of the leading intellectual centers in the world. Scholars traveled from across Africa, the Middle East, and yes, from Europe to study there. And one of those European scholars changed the course of Western history. His name was Geber of Aurillac. Born in France around 946 AD, Geber was a brilliant young monk who wanted to study mathematics. But Europe didn't have advanced mathematics. The Roman numeral system made complex calculations nearly impossible. There was no concept of zero. Algebra didn't exist in European thought. So Geber traveled to Islamic Spain and then to Morocco, where he spent 3 years studying at the University of Al-Qarawiyyin from 967 to 970 AD. At Al-Qarawiyyin, Geber learned the Arabic numeral system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the revolutionary concept of zero. He learned algebra. He learned astronomical calculations. He learned to use the astrolabe, an instrument for measuring the positions of stars. He absorbed knowledge that African and Arab scholars had been developing for centuries. Then Gerbert went back to Europe, and Europe lost its mind. They called him the greatest mind of his generation. They made him Archbishop of Reims. They made him Archbishop of Ravenna. And in 999 AD, they made him Pope. Pope Sylvester II, the first French Pope. And when Pope Sylvester II introduced Arabic numerals to Europe, when he taught European scholars algebra, when he demonstrated the astrolabe, Europeans credited him as a genius inventor. Some even accused him of witchcraft, because how else could he know such advanced concepts? But Gerbert didn't invent anything. He learned it all at an African university. He was a student sitting in lecture halls in Morocco, being taught by African scholars, studying texts written by African and Arab mathematicians. Yet European history books call him the inventor of the mechanical clock, the introducer of Arabic numerals, a mathematical genius. They don't mention where he learned it. They don't credit the African institution that taught him. They don't name the African professors who were his teachers. They erase the source and claim the genius for Europe. This is the pattern. This is what they did over and over and over again. European scholars studied in African universities, took that knowledge back to Europe, and got credit for discoveries and inventions that Africans created first. But we're just getting started, because Al-Qarawiyyin is only the first African university. There are 4 more that will blow your mind, and the biggest one, the most impressive one, had 25,000 students, when Oxford had 1,500. We're going to that one next. But first, I need you to understand something crucial. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin still exists today. You can visit it right now. You can walk through the same halls where students studied, 165 years ago. You can see manuscripts from the 9th century in its library. The institution that Fatima al-Fihri built has survived 11 centuries. It survived the fall of empires. It survived colonization. It survived everything. And it's still teaching students today. That's not legend. That's not mythology. That's documented historical fact, recognized by UNESCO, the Guinness Book of World Records, and every legitimate historian on the planet. So when someone tells you Africa has no history, when someone suggests Africans were primitive before European contact, when someone claims Africa contributed nothing to human civilization, you tell them about Fatima al-Fihri. You tell them about the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. You tell them that the first university in human history was built by a black African woman. And then you tell them about Timbuktu, because what happened in Timbuktu makes Al-Qarawiyyin look small. Let me take you to West Africa in the year 1100 AD. The Mali Empire is rising. This isn't a small kingdom. We're talking about an empire that at its height will control territory larger than Western Europe. An empire sitting on some of the richest gold deposits in the world. An empire that will produce Mansa Musa, the wealthiest human being in recorded history. His net worth in today's money, $400 billion. Not million, billion. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold and spent so lavishly that he crashed the Egyptian economy. He devalued gold in Cairo for 10 years. That's how wealthy the Mali Empire was. And what did they do with that wealth? They built universities, plural, not one university, not 2. An entire system of Islamic education centered in the city of Timbuktu. By the 1300s, Timbuktu had become the intellectual capital of Africa. 3 major universities anchored the city: Sankore University, Jingwereber University, Sidi Yahya University. These weren't small schools. Sankore alone had 25,000 students enrolled at its peak. Let me repeat that. 25,000 students in the 1400s. At the same time, the University of Oxford had about 1,500 students. Paris had maybe 4,000. Sankore had 25,000. The campus had 180 Quranic schools feeding into it. It had hundreds of professors, each paid by the state. And these professors weren't poorly compensated teachers barely scraping by. They were among the highest paid intellectuals in the world. Some professors at Sankore earned more than high court judges. The Mali Empire valued education that much. Now here's what will really blow your mind. We know exactly what they were teaching because the evidence survived. Between 700,000 and 1 million manuscripts were produced in Timbuktu between the 13th and 17th centuries. That's not an estimate historians made up. That's based on documented collections, library records, and the manuscripts that still exist today. These manuscripts covered every subject you can imagine. Islamic theology and law, obviously, but also mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, astronomy, and astrology. Students were calculating planetary movements, eclipse patterns, and star positions, medicine and surgery. There are Timbuktu manuscripts describing cataract surgery treatments of smallpox anatomical studies and pharmaceutical recipes, chemistry and alchemy. Historians found texts on metallurgy, dye production, and chemical processes, geography and cartography, detailed maps of Africa that were more accurate than European maps of the same era, history and biography, chronicles of kings' empires and major events, poetry and literature, philosophy and logic, music theory and composition. This was a complete educational system covering the full range of human knowledge, and the manuscripts prove it. Let me tell you about one specific scholar so you understand the level of intellectual achievement we're talking about. His name was Ahmed Baba al-Masufi al-Timbukti. Born in Timbuktu in 1556, died in 1627. Ahmed Baba was a legal scholar, historian, and biographer, and his personal library contained 1,600 books, his personal collection. Not the university library, his private collection at home. In 1590s Europe, the largest private library belonged to Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher and essayist. His library had about 1,000 books. Ahmed Baba had 1,600 in Africa, in Timbuktu. A black African scholar owned more books than the most educated European of his time. Ahmed Baba wrote more than 40 books himself, works on Islamic law, grammar, biographical dictionaries of scholars. His most famous work, Mi'raj al-Su'ud, is a biographical dictionary listing over 150 Maliki scholars. It's still referenced by Islamic scholars today, but here's the tragedy. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultanate invaded Timbuktu. The Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur wanted control of the gold trade, but he also wanted something else. He wanted the scholars. He wanted their knowledge. When Moroccan forces captured Timbuktu, they specifically targeted the universities and libraries. They seized manuscripts. They arrested scholars, and they took Ahmed Baba prisoner. Ahmed Baba was enslaved and forced to march across the Sahara Desert to Marrakesh. He was 35 years old. They took him from his family, his library, his students. They forced him into captivity in Morocco, where he lived for 14 years. During that captivity, Ahmed Baba was forced to teach. The Moroccan Sultan wanted him to educate Moroccan scholars. So even in chains, Ahmed Baba taught. He wrote. He continued his scholarly work under duress. In 1607, he was finally allowed to return to Timbuktu. He was 51 years old. He had spent 14 years in captivity. And when he came home, he found his library destroyed. Of his 600 books, only a few hundred survived. The Moroccan army had looted the rest. Some manuscripts were burned. Some were stolen and taken to Morocco. Some were lost in the chaos of occupation. Ahmed Baba spent the last 20 years of his life trying to rebuild what was destroyed. He died in 1627 at age 71, still teaching, still writing, still preserving knowledge. Now let me tell you why this matters. Why I'm spending so much time on one scholar's library. Because Ahmed Baba wasn't unique. He was typical. There were dozens of scholars in Timbuktu, with libraries of hundreds or thousands of books. When Moroccan forces invaded, they found a city where literacy was common, where scholarship was valued above wealth, where intellectual debate happened in mosques and markets and homes. One contemporary account from Leo Africanus, a North African scholar who visited Timbuktu in 1510, described it this way. In Timbuktu, there are numerous judges, doctors of letters, and learned Muslims. The king greatly honors learning. Many handwritten books coming from North Africa are sold. More profit is made from selling books in Timbuktu than from any other merchandise. More profit from books than from any other merchandise. In a city sitting on gold mines, books were more valued than gold. Let that sink in. Your ancestors valued education more than material wealth. They built a civilization where the highest status came not from having the most gold, but from having the most knowledge, where professors earned more than judges, where private libraries held thousands of volumes, where 25,000 students could study simultaneously. This wasn't primitive. This wasn't savage. This was one of the most advanced intellectual cultures in human history, and it existed in Africa, built by Africans, taught by Africans, while Europe was barely crawling out of feudalism. But here's what they don't tell you. Here's the part that makes this even more enraging. When Europeans first reached Timbuktu in the 1800s, they knew what they were looking for. They had heard stories about the legendary city of gold and learning. Arab traders had told them. North African scholars had written about it. Europeans knew Timbuktu existed and knew it was significant. So when French and British explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 1820s and 1830s, what did they find? They found manuscripts, thousands upon thousands of manuscripts. They found evidence of exactly what had been described. A major center of learning with libraries, universities, and scholars. And what did they do? They looted it. French colonial forces, when they occupied Timbuktu in 1893, systematically seized manuscripts and shipped them to Paris. Thousands of manuscripts ended up in French libraries and museums. The British forces did the same thing. Manuscripts were taken to London, to the British Museum, to university collections. German scholars got in on it too. And when they wrote about what they found, they couldn't accept it. They couldn't accept that Africans created this. So they made up theories. Leo Frobenius, a German ethnologist who explored Africa in the early 1900s, literally theorized that Timbuktu must have been built by survivors from Atlantis. Atlantis, a fictional city from Plato's dialogues. He claimed a mythical civilization created Timbuktu because he couldn't accept that black Africans built it. Other European scholars claimed Arabs built it, not Africans, despite the fact that the scholars were African, the students were African, and the city was in Africa, controlled by African empires. They performed intellectual gymnastics to avoid admitting the obvious truth. Africans built Timbuktu. Africans wrote those manuscripts. Africans created that intellectual tradition. But accepting that truth would have destroyed the justification for colonization. If Africans were sophisticated scholars with universities older than Oxford, how could Europe justify the scramble for Africa? How could they claim they were bringing civilization to savages? They couldn't. So they buried the truth. They called it myth. They attributed it to other civilizations. They took the manuscripts and locked them in European museums, where most people would never see them. And for 100 years, it worked. Most people forgot about Timbuktu's intellectual legacy. It became a punchline, a metaphor for a place that's far away and doesn't matter. From here to Timbuktu, people would say meaning, the middle of nowhere. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the manuscripts. Because while European colonizers were stealing thousands of manuscripts, Timbuktu families were hiding hundreds of thousands more. When they heard French soldiers were coming, families buried manuscripts in metal boxes underground. They hid them in secret rooms. They smuggled them out of the city to smaller towns and villages. For over 100 years, these families preserved manuscripts in secret, passing down the knowledge of where they were hidden from generation to generation. And in the late 1900s and early 2000s, those manuscripts started resurfacing. Families began bringing them out of hiding. Private libraries were discovered with collections of thousands of manuscripts. International organizations started funding preservation efforts. And as scholars began cataloging and translating these manuscripts, the full scale of Timbuktu's intellectual achievement became undeniable. Today, there are an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 manuscripts that survived in Timbuktu and surrounding areas. The Ahmed Babar Institute, named after the scholar I told you about, houses over 30,000 manuscripts. Private family libraries contain hundreds of thousands more. And these aren't just religious texts. Scholars are finding mathematical proofs, astronomical calculations, medical treatises, legal commentaries, historical chronicles, and philosophical essays. In 2013, when Islamic extremists occupied Timbuktu, one of the first things they did was try to burn the manuscripts. They saw them as a threat, but librarians and ordinary citizens risked their lives to save them. They smuggled manuscripts out of Timbuktu in trunks and suitcases, loading them onto boats and trucks, moving them hundreds of miles to safety. Why would people risk their lives for old books? Because those manuscripts are proof. Proof that the narrative of African inferiority is a lie. Proof that African intellectual achievement rivaled or exceeded European achievement for centuries. Proof that when Europe was in the Dark Ages, Africa was in a golden age. And that proof is dangerous. It's dangerous to every system built on the lie of white supremacy. It's dangerous to every justification for colonization and slavery. It's dangerous because it means everything they taught you about Africa was wrong. Now I need you to see the pattern, because Al-Qarawiyyin and Timbuktu aren't isolated incidents. They're not exceptions to some rule. They're examples of a pattern that covered the entire African continent. So let me quickly take you through 3 more universities that prove this beyond any shadow of doubt. First, the University of Zaytouna in Tunis, Tunisia, founded in 737 AD. That's 122 years before Al-Qarawiyyin, 359 years before Oxford. This university is still operating today, still teaching students. For 288 years, the University of Zaytouna has been educating scholars in Islamic law theology, Arabic grammar logic, and mathematics. Ibn Khaldun studied there. You know Ibn Khaldun? He's considered the father of sociology, the father of historiography, the father of economics. His book, the Muqaddimah, written in 1377, laid out theories of social conflict, economic cycles, and historical methodology that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the 1800s. Adam Smith, considered the father of modern economics, published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Ibn Khaldun published economic theories 400 years earlier. Karl Marx published theories of class conflict in the mid-1800s. Ibn Khaldun wrote about social stratification and conflict 500 years earlier. European scholars are called the fathers of these fields, but an African scholar got there first. And where did Ibn Khaldun study? At the University of Zaytouna in Tunisia. an African university. This is the third African university founded before any European university. 3. Al-Qarawiyyin in 859, Ezituna in 737. And we haven't even gotten to Ethiopia yet. In the Axum Kingdom, and later in Lalibela Christian learning centers, existed from the 4th century AD onward. We're talking about 300s, 400s, 500s. Monasteries with schools, libraries with manuscripts, scholars studying theology, translating texts, teaching students. The Garima Gospels housed in the Garima Monastery in Ethiopia are the oldest surviving illuminated Christian manuscripts in the world. They date to sometime between 390 and 660 AD. That means the oldest illustrated Christian texts we have are in Africa. Not Rome, not Constantinople, Ethiopia. And these monasteries weren't just preserving texts, they were creating them. The Ge'ez script, one of the world's oldest alphabets, still in use, was developed in Ethiopia. Students learned to read and write Ge'ez. They studied mathematics, astronomy, theology, history. When European travelers reached Ethiopia in the 1500s and 1600s, they found rock-hewn churches carved from solid stone, requiring advanced engineering and mathematics. They found monasteries with libraries containing thousands of manuscripts. They found a Christian kingdom that had existed for over 1,000 years, with its own intellectual tradition. And what did Europeans say? Some claimed Ethiopians must have had help from Europeans or Middle Easterners. They couldn't possibly have built this themselves. Same pattern, same denial, same erasure. But the evidence is there. The churches are there. The manuscripts are there. The Ge'ez script is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox services today. You can visit these places right now. 5th, let me take you to ancient Nubia, in what's now Sudan. The Kingdom of Kush, the Nubian civilization that existed from 2500 BC to 350 AD. Nubia has more pyramids than Egypt. Sudan has 255 pyramids. Egypt has 138. Let me say that again for the people in the back. Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt. These pyramids required advanced mathematics to build. Geometry, engineering, architectural planning. The Nubians weren't copying Egypt. In many periods, Nubia conquered Egypt. The 25th dynasty of Egypt was Nubian. Black African pharaohs ruled Egypt for nearly a century, and Nubian cities had schools. We know this from archaeological evidence, buildings identified as schools, writing tablets used for instruction, evidence of literacy and education. But when textbooks talk about pyramids, they talk about Egypt. When they talk about African civilization, they talk about Egypt, and then pretend Egypt wasn't in Africa. They separate Egypt from the rest of Africa, as if the Sahara Desert is an impenetrable barrier. But Nubia proves the connection. Nubia was south of Egypt, undeniably African, undeniably black, and undeniably sophisticated. And they taught their children mathematics, sophisticated enough to build pyramids. So let's count. 5 examples. 5 centers of learning. 5 proof points that span the entire African continent and over 2,000 years of history. The University of Ezituna, founded 737 AD North Africa. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded 859 AD North Africa. Timbuktu's university system, peak 1300s, 1500s West Africa. Ethiopian Christian learning centers, 300s AD onward East Africa. Nubian educational systems, 2500 BC to 350 AD Northeast Africa. This isn't one anomaly. This is a pattern of intellectual achievement across time and geography. This is a continent-wide tradition of education scholarship and knowledge preservation. And every single one of these examples predates European universities. Every single one. Do you see it now? Do you see what they did? They took a continent with a multi-thousand-year tradition of education and scholarship. They took peoples who built universities, wrote hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, and made discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. And they called them savages. They called them primitive. They claimed Africa had no history, no civilization, no intellectual tradition. And then they enslaved millions of these people. They colonized the entire continent. They stole the manuscripts and put them in European museums. They rewrote the textbooks to erase every achievement. They literally removed Africa from its own history. But here's what they couldn't erase: the buildings, the manuscripts, the evidence. It survived. Families in Timbuktu buried manuscripts for 100 years and then brought them back out. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin is still standing after 165 years. The Garama Gospels are still in Ethiopia. The pyramids of Nubia are still there. The evidence survived. And now we know. Now we have proof. Now we can look at the record and see exactly what happened. They knew. Europeans knew about African intellectual achievement. Arab traders told them. North African scholars wrote about it. European scholars studied at African universities. They knew Africans were educated, sophisticated, and intellectually accomplished. And they enslaved them anyway. They colonized them anyway. They erased the history anyway. Because knowledge is power, and they couldn't let Africans keep that power. So they took the manuscripts, they took the land, they took the people, and they tried to take the truth. They almost succeeded. For 400 years, most of the world believed the lie. Most people thought Africa had no civilization before European contact. Most people thought Africans contributed nothing to human knowledge. Most black people grew up never knowing their ancestors built the first universities. But the truth survived, hidden in manuscripts buried under Timbuktu homes, preserved in universities still teaching after 1,000 years, written in stone in Ethiopian churches and Nubian pyramids. The truth survived, and now you know it. Now we need to talk about how they pulled it off. Because this wasn't accidental amnesia. This wasn't innocent forgetting. This was systematic, deliberate, calculated erasure, backed by laws, military force, and propaganda. And understanding how they did it will help you see why the same tactics are still being used today against black education, black history, and black intellectual achievement. Let me walk you through the 4 methods they used to bury the truth about African universities: physical destruction, legal suppression, educational erasure, and media manipulation. Each one was deployed systematically. Each one had specific goals, and each one is still happening right now. Let's start with physical destruction, because this is the most brutal and the most obvious. When Moroccan forces invaded Timbuktu in 1591, their commander wasn't just after gold. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur had a specific strategy. He wanted to break the intellectual power of the Mali Empire. So his forces targeted the universities first. They arrested professors. They burned libraries. They looted manuscripts. I told you about Ahmed Baba and his 1,600 books. When Moroccan soldiers came to his house, they didn't just take him prisoner. They destroyed his library. They took what they wanted and burned the rest. Why? Because they understood something fundamental. As long as a people have their history, their books, their intellectual tradition, they can resist conquest. But if you destroy their libraries, if you kill their scholars, if you erase their knowledge, you can break their spirit. The Moroccan commander wrote in his diary, and this is a direct quote from historical records, "We must destroy their books, because as long as they have their history, they will resist." He wrote that down. He documented his own crime. He understood exactly what he was doing. And that diary is in the French National Archives right now. You can go read it. This wasn't some conspiracy theory. This wasn't something I'm making up. The colonizers documented their strategy of destroying African knowledge. But Morocco was just the beginning. When European colonization kicked into full gear in the 1800s, this strategy became policy across the entire continent. The French in West Africa didn't just conquer territory, they seized manuscripts. In 1893, when French colonial forces occupied Timbuktu, they went straight to the libraries. They loaded manuscripts onto carts and shipped them to Paris. Thousands of manuscripts. And I'm not talking about ancient history. I'm talking about 130 years ago. Your great-great-grandparents were alive. This was their lifetime. And those manuscripts are still in France. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library, has entire collections of Timbuktu manuscripts. Stolen property, cultural theft, right there in Paris. Available for French scholars to study, but taken from the African families who preserved them for centuries. The British did the same thing in East Africa. When they colonized Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, they found Swahili manuscripts, historical documents, and educational texts. They seized them, sent them to London. The British Museum has rooms full of African artifacts and manuscripts that were never purchased, never donated, just taken. The Belgians in Congo were even more brutal. King Leopold II's forces didn't just steal manuscripts, they burned anything that documented Congolese civilization. Why? Because Leopold was running one of the most horrific exploitation systems in human history. He was killing millions of Congolese people to extract rubber and ivory. And if the world knew that Congolese people had sophisticated kingdoms, art, literature, and educational systems, it would be harder to justify the genocide. So they destroyed the evidence. They burned books. They smashed sculptures. They tore down buildings. They erased material proof of Congolese civilization. And when international journalists started exposing Leopold's atrocities in the early 1900s, one of the things they reported was the systematic destruction of Congolese cultural heritage. Not just people, culture, knowledge, history, all deliberately destroyed. But here's what's even more chilling. This physical destruction had a specific pattern. In every case, the colonizers targeted educational institutions first: universities, libraries, schools, mosques that functioned as teaching centers. It wasn't random, it was strategic. In Timbuktu, they went for the manuscripts. In Ethiopia, when Italy invaded in 1935, Italian forces specifically bombed churches and monasteries that held ancient texts. In Sudan, British colonizers demolished Quranic schools. In Somalia, they shut down traditional centers of learning. Over and over across the continent, the first targets were always the places where knowledge was kept and transmitted. And the families who owned these manuscripts understood what was happening, so they hid them. In Timbuktu, when word spread that French soldiers were coming, families dug holes in their homes and buried manuscripts in metal boxes. They hid them in secret rooms behind false walls. They moved them to villages outside the city. For over 100 years, from the 1890s to the 1990s, these families kept the manuscripts hidden. Grandparents told their children where the manuscripts were buried. Those children told their children. Generation after generation, families risked everything to preserve knowledge. Why would they do that? Why would ordinary people, most of them not wealthy, most of them struggling under colonial oppression, why would they protect old books? Because they knew those manuscripts were proof of who they were, proof of what their ancestors achieved, proof that the colonizers were lying when they called Africans primitive and uncivilized. And they were right. When those manuscripts started coming out of hiding in the 1990s and 2000s, when scholars began cataloging and studying them, the full scale of Timbuktu's intellectual tradition became undeniable. The physical evidence survived, despite everything. But physical destruction was only the first method. The second method was legal suppression, and this is where it gets really calculated. European colonial powers didn't just burn books and arrest scholars. They passed laws making it illegal to teach African history. I'm not exaggerating. Let me give you specific examples with dates and names. In French West Africa, which included modern-day Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and several other countries, the French implemented what they called the assimilation policy starting in the 1880s. The goal was to turn Africans into Frenchmen, to erase African identity and replace it with French identity. And education was the primary tool. The French West Africa Educational Decree of 1903 mandated that all education in French colonies be conducted in French only, not in local languages, not in Arabic, which was the language of scholarship in places like Timbuktu, French, and the curriculum could only teach French history, French literature, French values. It was illegal for schools to teach about African kingdoms, African scholars, or African achievements. If you were a teacher in French West Africa in 1903 and you tried to teach your students about the Mali Empire, you could be arrested. If you tried to teach about Ahmed Baba and the scholars of Timbuktu, you broke the law. This wasn't cultural preference. This was legislated erasure. The British used a slightly different system called indirect rule, but the result was the same. They installed local chiefs who would do what the British wanted. And one of the things the British wanted was control over education. The British Education Ordinance of 1887 in Nigeria required that all schools follow a British curriculum. No teaching of pre-colonial Nigerian history. No teaching about the Benin Kingdom or the Oyo Empire or the sophisticated political systems that existed before colonization. Just British history, kings and queens of England, British colonial victories, British civilization. And if you wanted your school to receive any funding, if you wanted certification, if you wanted your students' degrees to be recognized, you had to teach the British curriculum. Schools that taught African history got shut down. Teachers who insisted on teaching about African achievements lost their positions. The system created a choice: teach British propaganda or lose everything. Most schools chose survival, and an entire generation grew up learning European history while their own history was erased. In the Belgian Congo, it was even more extreme. The Belgian Colonial Charter of 1908 gave King Leopold II, and later the Belgian government, total control over education. And they decided education would be conducted exclusively by Catholic missionaries. These missionaries were explicitly told not to teach about pre-colonial Congolese civilization. The curriculum they developed portrayed Congolese people as having lived in darkness and chaos before the arrival of Europeans. Christianity and European civilization were framed as gifts, saving Africans from their own barbarism. Students learned to read and write, but only so they could work for Belgian companies and colonial administration. They learned arithmetic, but only enough to count currency and measure rubber quotas. They learned nothing about Congolese kingdoms, Congolese art, Congolese intellectual traditions. And this was law, codified in the colonial charter. By 1920, 30 years into this system, an entire generation of Africans had gone through colonial schools, learning nothing about their own history. They learned about Julius Caesar, but not Mansa Musa. They learned about the Roman Empire, but not the Mali Empire. They learned about Oxford and Cambridge, but not Al-Qarawiyyin and Timbuktu. This was deliberate manufactured amnesia, and it worked. When African countries started gaining independence in the 1950s and 1960s, they found that their own educated citizens didn't know their own history. Teachers trained in colonial schools didn't know what to teach about pre-colonial Africa because they had never learned it themselves. Textbooks written during colonial rule portrayed African history as beginning with European arrival. There was no infrastructure for teaching the truth because the truth had been systematically suppressed for 60 to 80 years. Multiple generations had grown up in the erasure. And here's what makes this even more insidious. These laws didn't just affect Africa. When Africans were enslaved and brought to America, similar laws were passed here. In the American South, slave codes made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. In South Carolina, the law was passed in 1740, in Georgia in 1755, in North Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, and other slave states' laws explicitly prohibited teaching enslaved Africans to read or write. The penalty fines for the teacher, whipping for the enslaved person who learned. Why? Because slave owners understood the same thing Moroccan and European colonizers understood. Knowledge is power. If enslaved people learned to read, they could read about freedom. They could read about revolution. They could forge documents. They could communicate across plantations. They could educate themselves into resistance. So it had to be illegal. And after the Civil War, when slavery legally ended, what happened during Reconstruction? Black communities built schools. They hired teachers. They created educational institutions. And white supremacists burned them down. The Ku Klux Klan specifically targeted black schools. Teachers were beaten or killed. School buildings were torched. In 1866 in Memphis, Tennessee, white mobs burned 12 black schools during a 3-day riot. In 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, white supremacists destroyed black schools and businesses during a coup that overthrew the biracial local government. Over and over the pattern repeated. Black people built schools. White supremacists destroyed them. And when destruction wasn't enough, they used law. Jim Crow segregation laws mandated separate and unequal schools. Black schools received a fraction of the funding white schools got. In 1915 in Mississippi, the state spent $50 per white student and $5 per black student. 10 times difference. By law. This wasn't neglect. This was policy. The same policy Europe used in Africa. Suppress education, control curriculum, prevent people from learning their own history, keep them intellectually dependent and easy to exploit. And even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 legally ended school segregation, the resistance continued. Schools were integrated on paper, but funding formulas ensured black schools stayed underfunded. Textbooks still taught white-centered history, African achievements. African intellectual traditions stayed out of the curriculum. In 2023, Florida banned AP African American Studies. Let me repeat that. In 2023, 2 years ago, a state government banned a college-level course on African American history. In 2024, Texas removed slavery from required curriculum topics. Teachers can teach it if they want, but they don't have to. It's optional. The erasure is still happening. The legal suppression is still happening. The same tactics that European colonizers used in the 1880s and 1890s are being deployed right now in American states. Ban the curriculum. Control what teachers can say. Make it illegal or professionally risky to teach the full truth. And call it parents' rights or protecting children from divisive concepts. But it's the same thing. It's legislated ignorance, deliberate manufactured amnesia, keeping people from knowing their own history so they can't draw power from it. That's the second method, legal suppression. But there's a third method that's even more insidious, educational erasure through textbooks. Even in places where teaching African history wasn't explicitly illegal, Even in places where teachers technically could talk about African civilization, the textbooks made it invisible. And this is where European and American intellectual elites come in. Because the erasure wasn't just done by soldiers and politicians. It was done by professors, philosophers, and historians who should have known better. Let me give you specific examples with names and dates so you can see exactly how this worked. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, German philosopher, one of the most influential thinkers in Western philosophy. In 1837, he published a series of lectures called The Philosophy of History. And in that book, Hegel wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Africa proper has no history." He literally said Africa has no history. He went on to say that Africa has no movement or development to exhibit, and that whatever happens in Africa belongs to the world of Asia and Europe, rather than to Africa itself. Hegel wasn't some fringe racist writing hateful pamphlets. He was a respected academic, teaching at the University of Berlin. His work was assigned reading in universities across Europe and America. Generations of students learned philosophy from Hegel, and embedded in his philosophy was the claim that Africa contributed nothing to human civilization. Now here's what makes this so infuriating. When Hegel wrote this in 1837, the University of Al-Qarawiyyin had been operating for 978 years. Timbuktu's manuscripts existed. Ethiopian churches were standing. The evidence of African intellectual achievement was available. Hegel could have known. He chose not to know. He chose to make a sweeping claim about an entire continent without bothering to research whether it was true. And his claim became canon. It was taught as fact in universities for over 100 years. David Hume, Scottish philosopher, another giant of Western thought. In 1753, he wrote in a footnote to his essay of National Characters, "I am apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. There was never a civilized nation of any other complexion than white. Never." Hume claimed that in all of history, no non-white civilization had ever achieved anything worth noting. Again, this is 1753. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin has been operating for 894 years. The Mali Empire existed. Great Zimbabwe existed. The evidence was there. But Hume dismissed it all without investigation, and his writings were taught as Enlightenment philosophy, as rational thought, as the foundation of Western intellectual tradition. The racism wasn't a side note. It was embedded in the core texts that defined Western education. Then you have Hugh Trevor Roper, Oxford professor, 1960s, much more recent. In 1963, he said in a lecture, perhaps in the future, there will be some African history to teach. But at present, there is none. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. 1963. He said this in 1963, after scholars had already documented Timbuktu's manuscripts, after the University of Al-Qarawiyyin had been recognized, after archaeological evidence from across Africa had been published. Trevor Roper was teaching at Oxford, one of the world's most prestigious universities, and he claimed Africa had no history. And Oxford let him say it. They didn't fire him. They didn't correct him. He kept his position and kept teaching students who would go on to become professors, journalists, politicians. Spreading the same lie, these weren't isolated opinions. This was the consensus in Western academia for centuries. And this consensus shaped textbooks. When textbook publishers created world history books, they followed what prestigious professors like Hegel, Hume, and Trevor Roper taught, which meant African history got maybe a chapter. Maybe. Usually focusing only on Egypt, and even then trying to disconnect Egypt from the rest of Africa. I remember the textbooks I grew up with. Ancient civilizations meant Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Egypt was in a separate category from sub-Saharan Africa, as if the Sahara Desert was an impenetrable barrier. But Timbuktu had trade routes across the Sahara. Mansa Musa crossed the Sahara on his way to Mecca. The barrier was in the textbook design, not in historical reality. Medieval history meant European feudalism, the Crusades, the Catholic Church. No mention of the Mali Empire, which existed at the same time, and was wealthier than any European kingdom. No mention of Timbuktu's universities. No mention of African scholars. Renaissance and Enlightenment meant European art, European philosophy, European science. No mention that Europe was translating Arabic texts written by African and Arab scholars. No mention that the Renaissance was built on knowledge preserved in places like Al-Qarawiyyin during Europe's Dark Ages. The structure of world history textbooks made it seem like civilization flowed in one direction, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, to Greece, to Rome, to Europe. Africa was a side note. Asia was exotic background. Europe was the main character of human history. And this structure wasn't neutral, it was designed. Textbook publishers worked with historians who had been trained in universities where Hegel and Hume were required reading. Those historians became textbook authors, and the erasure became standard curriculum. Even when civil rights movements in the 1960s pushed for more inclusive history, even when Black historians started publishing research on African civilizations, the textbooks changed slowly, very slowly, a paragraph here, a sidebar there. But the core narrative stayed the same. In 2015, a mother in Texas noticed her son's geography textbook referred to enslaved Africans as workers, not slaves. Workers, as if they were paid employees who chose to come to America. The textbook was published by McGraw-Hill, one of the biggest educational publishers in the world. After public outcry, they changed it. But think about how many students used that textbook before someone noticed. Think about how many other subtle erasures and distortions are still in textbooks right now. In 2018, researchers analyzed how slavery was taught in 10 commonly used US history textbooks. They found that most textbooks spent more time on European indentured servants than on African slavery. Most textbooks mentioned the 3/5 compromise, but didn't explain what it meant or why it mattered. Most textbooks framed slavery as a southern regional issue rather than a national system that built American wealth. And not a single one of the 10 textbooks mentioned African universities, African scholars, or African intellectual achievements before slavery. The textbook started African history with slavery, as if Africans had no history before Europeans arrived. As if Africa was a blank slate waiting for Europe to write on it. That's educational erasure. That's how you make 1,000 years of African intellectual achievement disappear without burning a single book. You just don't put it in textbooks. You teach the next generation that it didn't exist. And when they grow up and become teachers, they teach their students the same thing, because that's all they know. You don't have to burn libraries if you control what gets published. You don't have to arrest scholars if you control what gets taught. You just make the truth invisible, generation after generation, until most people don't even know what they don't know. But there's one more method, the fourth and final method of erasure, media manipulation. And this one is still happening right now in front of your eyes. When Europeans first encountered evidence of African civilization, they had a choice. They could report what they found honestly, or they could manipulate the story to fit the narrative they needed to justify slavery and colonization. Guess which one they chose? Media manipulation started in the 1800s with early anthropology and continued through newspapers, academic journals, documentary films, and now social media. Each generation used the dominant media of its time to distort, minimize, or erase African achievement. Let me show you how. In 1839, an American physician named Samuel Morton published a book called Crania Americana. Morton had collected over 600 human skulls from different populations around the world. He measured the internal volume of each skull, calculating brain size, and then he ranked races by intelligence, based on skull size. Surprise, surprise, he concluded that white Europeans had the largest skulls and therefore the highest intelligence. Africans had the smallest skulls and therefore the lowest intelligence. Morton's work was published by a respected medical publisher. It was reviewed positively in scientific journals. Other scientists built on his research. For decades, Crania Americana was cited as scientific proof of racial hierarchy. It was used to justify slavery. If Africans are naturally less intelligent, then slavery isn't a moral crime, it's a natural order. If black people have smaller brains, then they're not capable of building universities or writing manuscripts. They must have had help from Arabs or Europeans or some other more intelligent race. This was taught in medical schools. This was presented as objective science, and it was completely fraudulent. In the 1970s, anthropologist Stephen Jay Gould re-examined Morton's data. He found that Morton had systematically manipulated his measurements. When measuring European skulls, Morton packed them tightly with mustard seed to get the largest possible volume. When measuring African skulls, he packed them loosely to get smaller measurements. When skulls didn't fit his hypothesis, he excluded them from his data set. When he had multiple skulls from the same population, he cherry-picked which ones to include. Morton wasn't doing science. He was using the appearance of science to justify a predetermined, racist conclusion. But by the time Gould exposed this in the 1970s, Morton's work had influenced 130 years of racial pseudoscience. It had shaped anthropology, criminology, medicine, and education. The damage was done, and Morton wasn't alone. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, European and American anthropologists published books and articles claiming to prove racial hierarchy through skull measurements, facial features, and intelligence tests. All of it was designed to support the same conclusion: white supremacy. And all of it was presented as objective scientific truth. When Europeans encountered Great Zimbabwe, a massive stone city in southeastern Africa, built between 1100 and 1450 AD, they couldn't accept that Africans built it. The city covers 1/800 acres. It has walls 36 feet high made of granite blocks fitted together without mortar. The construction required sophisticated engineering mathematics and architectural planning. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a major trading empire that controlled gold and ivory trade across southeastern Africa. When German explorer Karl Mauck reached Great Zimbabwe in 1871, he examined the ruins and declared that Africans could not possibly have built it. He theorized it was built by the Queen of Sheba, or Phoenicians, or some other ancient civilization. Anything but Africans. When the British colonized the area in the 1890s, they promoted the same theory. The British South Africa Company, which controlled the territory, encouraged the myth that Great Zimbabwe was built by a lost white civilization. Why? Because if Africans built sophisticated stone cities, it undermined the justification for colonization. How can you claim you're bringing civilization to savages if the savages built cities more impressive than anything in early medieval Europe? So they lied. They promoted fringe theories. They silenced archaeologists who said the evidence clearly showed Bantu-speaking Africans built Great Zimbabwe. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall McIver examined Great Zimbabwe using scientific archaeological methods. He concluded definitively that Africans built it, medieval Africans, not ancient Phoenicians or mysterious lost civilizations. The British colonial government suppressed his findings. They prevented his research from being widely published in Africa. They continued promoting the myth. It wasn't until 1929 when another archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson conducted even more thorough research and reached the same conclusion that the scientific consensus finally shifted. But even then, the Rhodesian government, named after British colonizer Cecil Rhodes, continued teaching school children that Great Zimbabwe was built by non-Africans. This continued into the 1960s and 1970s. White Rhodesian children learned a lie because the truth threatened white supremacy. When those children grew up and read archaeology that said Africans built Great Zimbabwe, many refused to believe it. They'd been taught the opposite their entire childhood. The media manipulation had worked. Same pattern with Timbuktu. When European explorers finally reached Timbuktu in the 1820s, after centuries of hearing about it from Arab traders, they found a city in decline. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 had devastated it. French colonization in the 1890s further destroyed it. So when Europeans arrived, Timbuktu was a shadow of what it had been in the 1300s and 1400s, and European newspapers reported it as a disappointment. They called it overhyped. They said the legends were exaggerated. They mocked the idea that Timbuktu had ever been a great center of learning. French newspapers in the 1890s ran articles with headlines suggesting Timbuktu was always just a desert outpost with delusions of grandeur. They acknowledged the manuscripts existed, but suggested they were crude copies of Arab texts, not original African scholarship. When Leo Africanus's historical accounts of Timbuktu were rediscovered accounts describing a wealthy city where books were more valuable than gold, European scholars said he must have exaggerated. It couldn't have been that impressive. The media narrative became, Timbuktu is a legend, a myth maybe based on a small truth, but mostly fantasy. And that narrative stuck for decades. Even today, people use Timbuktu as a metaphor for a faraway place that doesn't really matter. From here to Timbuktu, meaning the middle of nowhere. That phrase itself is media manipulation internalized. It teaches people that Timbuktu is irrelevant, forgettable, not worth knowing about. But Timbuktu had 25,000 university students when Oxford had 1,500. Timbuktu produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Timbuktu was one of the intellectual capitals of the medieval world. The media made you forget that. Or more likely, the media made sure you never learned it in the first place. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you see the same manipulation in new forms. National Geographic, founded in 1888, became one of the most influential sources of information about the world for American audiences. For decades, National Geographic shaped how Americans understood Africa. And how did they portray Africa? Tribal villages, half-naked people, primitive customs, exotic animals, beautiful landscapes with noble savages living in harmony with nature. That was the image. Every National Geographic article about Africa reinforced the same tropes. Africans as primitive, unchanging, existing outside of history. When National Geographic did cover African archaeology or history, they framed it with surprise and wonder, as if it was shocking and unexpected that Africans had civilization. A 2015 article about Timbuktu manuscripts had the headline "Timbuktu's Hidden Scholars." The word hidden suggested these scholars were unknown, as if historians hadn't been writing about them for decades. The framing implied discovery, as if National Geographic was revealing something new, rather than reporting on something that had always been known in Africa. This is subtle manipulation. The article wasn't lying. It reported facts about the manuscripts. But the framing, the tone, the surprise in the headline, all of it reinforced the assumption that African intellectual achievement is unexpected and exceptional, rather than normal and historical. Hollywood did even worse. For over a century, Hollywood has portrayed Africa almost exclusively through a few narrow stereotypes. The jungle adventure where white explorers discover lost civilizations. Tarzan, King Solomon's Mines, the savage tribe that threatens the white protagonists. Dozens of movies. The exotic backdrop for white people's coming-of-age stories. Out of Africa. The animals and nature documentaries that show Africa as wilderness, not as a continent where people live and build cities and go to universities. When Hollywood does show African history, it's usually ancient Egypt, and they cast white actors. Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, Charlton Heston in The Ten Commandments, more recently Christian Bale, Joel Edgerton, Sigourney Weaver, all playing ancient Egyptians. Egypt was in Africa. Ancient Egyptians were African. But Hollywood whitewashes them, because acknowledging that Africans built the pyramids complicates the narrative of African inferiority. Black Panther in 2018 was revolutionary, simply because it showed a technologically advanced African nation. Think about that. It took until 2018 for a major Hollywood film to portray Africans as technologically sophisticated, and it was a fictional story about a made-up country with fictional technology. The bar was so low that fiction showing African advancement was groundbreaking. That tells you everything about how thoroughly Hollywood has erased real African achievement. They won't make a movie about Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man in history. They won't make a movie about Fatima al-Fihri building the first university. They won't make a movie about the scholars of Timbuktu preserving knowledge through centuries of invasion. Why? Because those true stories would shatter the image of Africa that Hollywood has spent a century building. The media manipulation continues today in different forms. When news outlets cover Africa, they focus overwhelmingly on poverty, disease, war, and corruption. There's a saying among African journalists, "If it bleeds, it leads but only in Africa." Western news organizations send correspondents to Africa, primarily to cover crises. Famine in Somalia, Ebola outbreak in West Africa, civil war in Sudan. These are real issues that deserve coverage, but they're not the only things happening in Africa. There are universities in Africa right now producing cutting-edge research. There are technology hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, and Cape Town creating innovative solutions. There are thriving cities, growing economies, and vibrant cultural scenes. But Western media gives those stories a fraction of the coverage they give to crisis stories. Why? Because crisis stories reinforce the narrative that Africa needs saving, that Africans can govern themselves, that Africa is perpetually backwards and struggling. And that narrative serves political and economic interests. It justifies international intervention. It makes Western aid seem like charity, rather than inadequate compensation for centuries of extraction. It keeps Africa in a subordinate position in global consciousness. Social media hasn't fixed this. If anything, it's made it worse in some ways. Algorithms amplify content that gets engagement, and content that reinforces people's existing beliefs gets more engagement than content that challenges those beliefs. So if someone has been taught their whole life that Africa is primitive, they're more likely to engage with social media content showing poverty in Africa than content showing universities in Africa. The algorithm learns their preference and shows them more poverty content. Their worldview gets reinforced. If someone has never learned about African universities, they won't search for information about African universities. They don't know what they don't know. So the algorithm never surfaces that information. The knowledge gap perpetuates itself. And when African creators try to share their history, their achievements, their true stories, they often get less reach than creators who reinforce stereotypes. YouTube's algorithm, TikTok's algorithm, Instagram's algorithm, all of them optimize for watch time and engagement, not for truth or educational value. A video titled 10 Shocking Facts About African Tribes might get millions of views. A video titled The 5 African Universities That Predated Oxford might get thousands. The algorithm doesn't care about correcting historical erasure. It cares about keeping people on the platform, so the manipulation continues in algorithmic form. Now let me connect this to something happening right now today in your lifetime. In 2023, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis rejected the AP African American Studies course for Florida high schools. The College Board had developed this course after years of consultation with historians and educators. The curriculum covered African civilizations before slavery, the experience of slavery reconstruction, the civil rights movement, and contemporary issues. Florida said no. DeSantis said the course violated Florida law against teaching critical race theory. He said it was indoctrination. The course was banned. Thousands of Florida students who wanted to take an advanced college-level course on African American history were told they couldn't. But here's what that really was. That was the same media manipulation Europeans used in the 1800s, applied to modern education. Control the narrative. Control what students learn. Keep them from knowing the full truth. Because if Florida students learned about African universities, if they learned about Timbuktu and Al-Qarawiyyin, if they learned that African intellectual achievement rivaled European achievement for centuries, they might start asking questions. They might ask why black schools are underfunded. They might ask about reparations. They might demand real equality instead of accepting symbolic gestures. So Florida banned the course. Same tactic. New generation. In 2024, Texas changed its social studies curriculum. Slavery was removed from the list of required topics. Teachers can still teach it, but they don't have to. It's optional. The erasure is still happening. The legal suppression is still happening. The same tactics that colonial powers used in Africa in the 1890s are being deployed in America in the 2020s. The methods have been refined, but the goal is the same. Keep black people from knowing their full history. Keep them from understanding their intellectual heritage. Keep them from drawing power from the knowledge that their ancestors built universities while Europeans lived in huts. Because that knowledge is dangerous. That knowledge is revolutionary. That knowledge threatens every system built on the lie of black inferiority. So they're still trying to suppress it. They're still passing laws to keep it out of schools. They're still controlling what gets into textbooks. They're still using media to reinforce stereotypes and erase achievement. The fight isn't over. The erasure is ongoing. And that brings us to the question you should be asking right now. If they're still trying this hard to hide the truth, what does that tell you? It tells you the truth is powerful. It tells you they're afraid of what happens when you know. And it tells you that everything they've done to you, everything your parents and grandparents experienced, every injustice and inequity you see today, it all connects back to this erasure. So let's make those connections explicit. Let's talk about why this history matters right now today in your life. You want to know why there's a wealth gap. You want to know why the median white household has $188,000 in wealth, while the median black household has $24,000. You want to know why that gap exists and why it's not getting better. It's because they stole your inheritance. Not just during slavery, though that was part of it. Not just during Jim Crow, though that was part of it too. They stole your intellectual inheritance. They stole your educational infrastructure. And they're still stealing it today. Let me connect the dots. When your ancestors were brought to America in chains, they came from civilizations with universities. They came from places where literacy was common, where scholarship was valued, where knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. They weren't primitive. They weren't blank slates. They were educated people being violently disconnected from their educational systems. And the first thing slave codes did was make it illegal to teach them to read. South Carolina in 1740, Georgia in 1755, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Every slave state passed laws making black literacy illegal. Why? Because literacy is power. Literacy means you can read maps and forge passes and communicate across plantations. Literacy means you can read about Haiti's revolution and get ideas. Literacy means you can teach yourself and teach others. So they made it a crime, punishable by whipping or death. For 250 years of slavery, generations of Africans and African Americans were legally prohibited from accessing education. That's 250 years of lost educational accumulation. Think about what happens to wealth when you can't educate your children. When your children can't read, they can't enter professions that require literacy. They can't become lawyers, doctors, teachers, merchants. They're limited to manual labor, low-wage work, no wealth accumulation. Then slavery ends in 1865. And for a brief moment during Reconstruction, there's hope. Black communities build schools. They hire teachers. They created educational institutions. And white supremacists couldn't let that continue. So they destroyed Reconstruction. They passed Jim Crow laws. They created separate and unequal school systems. And they specifically underfunded black schools to keep that progress from continuing. In 1900 in Mississippi, the state spent $50 per white student and $5 per black student. 10 times difference. By law. Imagine trying to get a quality education when your school gets 1/10 the funding. Imagine your building is falling apart while the white school across town is pristine. Imagine your textbooks are decades old and falling apart while white students get new books. Imagine your teacher is paid so little they have to work second jobs, while white teachers are paid enough to focus on teaching. That's what Jim Crow did, and it lasted for 80 years, from 1877 to 1954. That's another 80 years of educational suppression after 250 years of slavery. When Brown versus Board of Education supposedly ended school segregation in 1954, the real integration happened slowly and incompletely. Southern states resisted. They closed public schools rather than integrate them. They created private academies for white students. They used funding formulas that ensured black schools stayed underfunded even after official segregation ended. And even in the North, where schools theoretically integrated residential segregation, meant black students went to underfunded schools in black neighborhoods, while white students went to well-funded schools in white neighborhoods. So you've got 250 years of slavery where education was illegal. Then 80 years of Jim Crow, where education was legally unequal. Then 70 years of supposed integration, where education remained unequal through funding formulas and residential segregation. That's 400 years of systematic educational suppression. 4 centuries, and you wonder why there's a wealth gap. Education is the primary pathway to wealth in modern society. You can't become a doctor without education. You can't become a lawyer, engineer, architect, professor without education. Even business ownership requires financial literacy, legal knowledge, market understanding. All of that comes from education. When you suppress a group's access to education for 400 years, you guarantee they'll have less wealth. It's not complicated. It's cause and effect. And then they turn around and blame you for the gap. They say black people don't value education. They say black culture doesn't emphasize academic achievement. They say black students just don't try as hard. but your ancestors risked their lives to learn to read during slavery. Your great-grandparents built schools during Reconstruction, knowing white supremacists might burn them down. Your grandparents fought to integrate schools, knowing they'd face violence. Your parents pushed you to get an education, knowing it was the only path to a better life. Black people have always valued education. Black people have always fought for education. Black people built universities in Africa 1,000 years before Columbus was born. The problem isn't black culture. The problem is systematic suppression across 4 centuries, and the suppression continues today. HBCUs historically, black colleges and universities, receive a fraction of the funding that predominantly white institutions receive. On average, HBCUs get about $5,000 per student in state funding. Comparable predominantly white institutions get $50,000 per student, 10-to-1 ratio. Same as Mississippi in 1900. Different century, same ratio. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods receive less funding than schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. Teachers in black schools are paid less. Buildings are older and more poorly maintained. Resources are limited. Class sizes are larger. This is documented. This is measurable. This is happening right now. And when black students underperform on standardized tests, they blame the students. They say there's an achievement gap. They suggest maybe black students just aren't as capable. But the gap isn't in capability. The gap is in resources. You're comparing students who get $50,000 per year in funding to students who get $5,000 per year and acting surprised that outcomes are different. That's not an achievement gap. That's a resource gap. That's a funding gap. That's a we're still doing what we've always done gap. And here's why this connects to African universities. If black people knew that their ancestors built the first universities, if black children learned in kindergarten that a black woman founded the oldest university in continuous operation, if black students understood that African scholars were teaching algebra and astronomy while Europeans were dying of plague, the entire narrative of black intellectual inferiority would collapse. You can't tell a child they're not college material when they know their ancestors built colleges. You can't claim there's an achievement gap when the historical record shows African achievement exceeded European achievement for centuries. You can't justify underfunding black schools when African universities predated European universities by 200 years. The knowledge is a threat to the system, so they keep it out of schools. They ban AP African American Studies. They remove African history from textbooks. They make sure most black children graduate high school without ever learning about Al-Qarawiyyin Timbuktu, Sankore Ahmed Baba Fatima, al-Fihri Mansa Musa. Because if those children knew, they'd demand better. They'd demand equal funding. They'd demand reparations for 400 years of educational theft. They'd demand what's owed. And let's talk about reparations, because this is where the African university history becomes a legal argument. They say slavery was a long time ago. They say get over it. They say black people today weren't enslaved, so they shouldn't get compensation. But the theft is ongoing. The manuscripts stolen from Timbuktu are in French and British museums right now. Today, you can go to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris and see manuscripts that were taken from African families during colonization. Those manuscripts are worth billions of dollars in cultural value. They belong to the families who preserved them. They belong to the African institutions that created them. They're stolen property, and France refuses to return them. That's ongoing theft. The underfunding of black schools is ongoing theft. Every year that HBCUs receive $5,000 per student, while white institutions receive $50,000, that's theft. That's stolen educational opportunity. That's stolen future earnings. That's stolen wealth accumulation. Every black student who graduates with more debt because their school was underfunded, that's theft. Every black family that can't build generational wealth because their children couldn't access quality education, that's theft. The theft didn't end with slavery. It's happening right now. And if you calculate the value of what's been stolen, you're looking at trillions of dollars. Economist William Darity has calculated that if black Americans had been able to accumulate wealth at the same rate as white Americans since slavery ended, accounting for all the theft and suppression and discrimination, the reparations owed would be between $10 and $12 trillion. That's not a made-up number. That's based on documented wealth gap, documented discrimination, documented policies that prevented black wealth accumulation. Some estimates go higher. When you factor in stolen labor during slavery, stolen land after slavery, stolen businesses during events like the Tulsa Massacre, and Rosewood stolen educational opportunities across 400 years, you're looking at over $100 trillion in value extracted from black Americans. And that doesn't even include the African side, the manuscripts in European museums, the artifacts in British and French collections, the cultural heritage stolen during colonization, the resources extracted from Africa during colonial rule. When you add it all up, the debt is incalculable, and they know it. That's why they resist reparations so hard. That's why they say it's impossible, impractical, too expensive. Because if they admit they owe it, if they calculate what's actually owed, the number is so large it would require fundamental restructuring of wealth distribution. So they pretend the debt doesn't exist. They change the subject. They say slavery is over, move on. But you can't move on when the theft is ongoing. You can't move on when your schools are still underfunded. You can't move on when African manuscripts are still in European museums. You can't move on when the wealth gap keeps growing instead of shrinking. Moving on is what they want. Because if you move on, they get to keep what they stole. But if you remember, if you know the history, if you understand that your ancestors built universities while Europeans lived in huts, then you know what's owed. You know you're not asking for charity. You're demanding justice. You're demanding return of stolen property. You're demanding compensation for stolen labor, stolen land, stolen education, stolen opportunity across 400 years. That's not a handout. That's a debt payment. That's righting a wrong. And the African university history proves they knew. They knew Africans were sophisticated. They knew Africans had universities. They knew Africans had intellectual traditions. European scholars studied at African universities. Popes learned from African institutions. They documented it. They wrote about it. And then they enslaved Africans anyway. They colonized Africa anyway. They stole the manuscripts anyway. They erased the history anyway. That's not ignorance. That's not misunderstanding. That's calculated exploitation. That's knowing exactly what you're doing and doing it anyway, because profit matters more than morality. And that makes the debt even clearer. They can't claim they didn't know. The evidence proves they knew. They just didn't care. Now let's talk about what this means for you personally, because this isn't just about history. This isn't just about policy. This is about your identity, your self-concept, your understanding of who you are and where you come from. You've been lied to your whole life. The schools lied. The textbooks lied. The media lied. They told you Africa had no civilization before European contact. They told you Africans were primitive, savage, uncivilized. They told you slavery happened because Africans were weak and couldn't defend themselves. They told you the wealth gap exists because black people don't work as hard or don't value education. Every single one of those claims is a lie. Africa had universities when Europe was still in caves. Africans were building institutions of higher learning while Europeans were dying of plague. The people who were enslaved came from kingdoms with gold universities, with thousands of students, libraries with hundreds of thousands of books. They weren't weak. They were conquered through guns, germs, and steel, the same way Europeans conquered each other constantly throughout history. And the wealth gap exists because they spent 400 years systematically destroying black wealth and suppressing black education. None of this is your fault. None of this is because of anything lacking in you or your people. You are not descendants of slaves. You are descendants of scholars. You are descendants of university builders. You are descendants of people who valued knowledge so much they preserved manuscripts through 500 years of invasion, colonization, and oppression. You are descendants of Fatima al-Fihri, who built a university that still stands 165 years later. You are descendants of Ahmed Baba, who owned 1,600 books. You are descendants of scholars who taught algebra to Europeans and got no credit. That's who you are. That's your bloodline. That's your inheritance. And they tried to steal that from you, too. They stole your land. They stole your labor. They stole your wealth. And they tried to steal your identity by erasing your history. But they failed. The manuscripts survived. The buildings survived. The evidence survived. And now you know. You can't unknow this. You can't go back to believing the lies. You know now that your ancestors were intellectuals, scholars, builders, teachers. You know now that African achievement exceeded European achievement for centuries. You know now that the poverty, the inequality, the struggle, none of it is because of you. It was done to you, systematically, deliberately, across 400 years. And that knowledge changes everything. It changes how you see yourself. You're not a victim. You're a survivor. Your ancestors survived the Middle Passage. They survived slavery. They survived Reconstruction violence. They survived Jim Crow. They survived redlining, mass incarceration, police brutality, educational suppression. And they're still here. You're still here. That's not weakness. That's the strongest survival in human history. It changes how you see the struggle. When they underfund your schools, you know why. When they ban African American studies, you know why. When they tell your children they're not college material, you know why. It's not about capability. It's about control. It's about keeping you from knowing your power, and it changes your responsibility. Because now that you know, you have to tell others. You have to teach your children. You have to share this with your community. You have to be the one who breaks the cycle of erasure. Your grandmother didn't have access to this information. She lived in a time when textbooks erased African achievement, and there was no internet to find alternative sources. Your parents might have learned bits and pieces, but probably not the full story. But you know now. You have the evidence. You have the names, the dates, the places, the documents. You have proof. And that makes you responsible for passing it on. You can't let them erase it again. You can't let your children grow up believing the lies you were taught. You have to be the keeper of this truth. That's your divine assignment. And yes, I mean divine. Because God didn't bring your ancestors through the Middle Passage by accident. God didn't preserve manuscripts for 500 years by accident. God didn't let this truth survive every attempt to destroy it by accident. There's a purpose. There's a reason you're learning this now, in this moment, in this generation. God is revealing what was hidden. God is exposing what was buried. God is giving you the tools to break the chains, not just physical chains, mental chains, psychological chains, the chains of inferiority, shame, self-doubt. Those chains break when you know the truth. When you know your ancestors built universities, you walk differently. When you know your people were scholars, you think differently. When you know they tried to erase you, but failed, you fight differently. You're not fighting from a position of weakness, begging for scraps from a system that doesn't value you. You're fighting from a position of strength, demanding return of what was stolen, demanding payment of debts owed, demanding recognition of achievements deliberately erased. That's the difference knowledge makes. That's why they tried so hard to keep it from you. And that's why you have to hold on to it, now that you have it. If this truth has shaken you, if you're feeling that fire in your chest right now, I need you to do something. Don't just watch this video and move on. Don't let this be entertainment. This is ammunition. This is truth that needs to spread. So right now, before you forget, before the algorithm moves this video down your feed, I need you to do 3 things. First, comment 1 word below. Just type Fatima. That's it. Fatima al-Fihri, the woman who built the first university. Let me see how many people are learning her name for the first time. Let me see how many of us were kept in the dark. Every comment tells YouTube this video matters. Every comment fights the algorithm that wants to bury Black history. Second, hit that like button. Not for me, for Ahmed Baba, for the scholars whose names were erased, for the families who buried manuscripts for 100 years to keep the truth alive. Every like is a declaration. You're saying, I know now. I see the lie. I'm choosing truth. And likes tell the algorithm to show this video to more people. It's that simple. More likes means more reach, means more people learn what they tried to hide. Third, share this video with one person who needs to know. Maybe it's your cousin who teaches school. She needs to know this so she can teach it, even if it's not in the textbook. Maybe it's your friend who says slavery is over, stop complaining. He needs to see that the theft is ongoing. Maybe it's your child who's struggling in school, who's been told they're not smart enough. They need to know their ancestors were scholars. Just one person. Send them this link. Tell them to watch it all the way through. Tell them this is the history we were never taught. Because here's the truth. YouTube's algorithm buries Black history. It buries educational content. It buries anything that challenges the narrative. The algorithm wants you watching dances and drama and celebrity gossip, not learning that your ancestors built universities while Europe lived in huts. But if enough of us share, if enough of us comment, if enough of us engage, we can force the algorithm to spread truth instead of lies. We can use their own tools against them. Social media is the only place left where we control the narrative. They're banning this in schools right now. Florida banned AP African American Studies in 2023. Texas made slavery optional in the curriculum. Multiple states are passing laws making it illegal to teach what they call divisive concepts, which really means teaching the truth about racism. They're doing in America what colonial powers did in Africa in the 1890s, controlling education, banning truth, manufacturing ignorance. But they don't control YouTube. Not completely. Not yet. So this is the battlefield. This is where we fight back. And you are a soldier in this fight, whether you realized it or not. Watching this video is an act of resistance. Learning this history is an act of resistance. Sharing it is an act of resistance. They want you ignorant. You're choosing knowledge. They want you ashamed. You're choosing pride. They want you silent. You're choosing to speak. So comment Fatima. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs it. Do it right now before you scroll away. Because this moment matters. This is your awakening. Don't let it fade.